We are going through the book of Esther. This is part 3 in our 5-part series in this book. And we are starting in chapter 5, I believe. And so we just need to do a quick recap of where we've been so that you can understand where the story goes from here. Today we are focusing on the title character of this story, which is Queen Esther herself. So this story is set in the city of Susa in the year 480 BCE. Now, Susa is the capital of the Persian Empire at this time, and a man named King Ahasuerus is on the phone. Oh, he's on the phone. Come on, Craig. He's on the throne. Woo, it's going to be a good one today. He is married to a woman named Queen Vashti, who at the end of a party, he says, "Hey, Queen Vashti, come over here and do a lewd sexual act in front of all my friends." Queen Vashti says no, and her no is holy. And he responds to this holiness by banishing her from his kingdom. This then opens up a position, because it's kind of what it is, to be his wife moving forward. And he says to all the women that are in the Persian Empire, we're going to find the most beautiful, most attractive woman, and whoever pleases me the most will be the next queen. There is a man living in Susa who is a Jewish man, and his name is Mordecai. Let me hear you say Mordecai this morning. Mordecai has an adopted daughter named Esther, and he says to Esther, This is not an optional activity for you to participate in. I know you are beautiful. You will be selected to participate in this contest. And sure enough, the Persian guard comes along and takes Esther to the royal harem, where she stays there for several months upon months, and then eventually she gets her time with the king. And as we talked about last week's service, she pleased the king a great deal, and he chose to make her his wife and the new queen of Persia, Queen Esther. Now, it's here that we're introduced to another character in the story that is a very important character. His name is Haman. Let me hear you say Haman this morning. Now, I grew up saying the name was Haman. If you say Haman, that's fine. The correct pronunciation, though, is Haman, and he is King Ahasuerus' second in command. And Haman loves himself very much, to the point of it being a fault. And he comes up with a great idea one day, and he says to the king, "Hey, why don't we make it a rule to show everyone how great you are, that they should bow the minute they see your second in command walk anywhere in the city?" And the king says, "That's great." And so a royal edict goes out, and the edict states that if anyone sees Haman, they are to bow. So everyone bows before Haman as he parades throughout the city of Susa, except for Mordecai. And this makes Haman very angry. So angry, in fact, that he goes back to the king and he says, "Why don't we create a rule that says that everyone that is related to Mordecai, why don't we just execute them all? Let's do a mass genocide on Mordecai, and not just Mordecai, but all of his people, all of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire." The king hears this and says, "That's a great idea." And so he seals it with the royal signet, and an edict goes out from the palace to all the people of Susa that says all of the Jewish people will soon be executed. Mordecai hears this and is furious, understandably, right? And so he begins the protest by wearing sackcloth and ashes and going to the palace gates and saying, "This law is unjust." And he is there in the sackcloth and ashes. He's making a big scene, and Queen Esther, his adopted daughter, hears about it. She sends a messenger to him and says, "Hey, quiet down. You're disturbing my palace because I belong here, remember?" And Mordecai hears that and sends a messenger back to her and says, "I need you to go before the king and beg him to change this law because we're all going to die if you don't intervene." And Esther sends a messenger back to him and says, "I can't do that because if I show up in the king's court uninvited, I could be put to death by the king because that's the law in Persia." To which Mordecai responds with one of the great lines in Scripture when he says to her, "Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Maybe the whole reason you're a queen is for this moment. And if you miss this moment, maybe you've missed the entire point of you coming to this royal dignity." This is where we ended last week's sermon, and we didn't talk about Esther's reply much, but this is what she sends back to Mordecai after hearing this fantastic line from him. She writes back through a messenger, "Okay, bring together all the Jewish people in Susa now and fast for me. I will go before the king. She goes on to say, do not eat or drink day and night for 3 days. I want all of you with me. And then she says another great line in scripture, which is, if I die, I die. Which sounds like it's straight out of Rocky IV. It's very close. So then, Esther then says, I'm going to go before the king. I want 3 days to get my head straight. I want the Jewish people to be with me by fasting and showing that they're in solidarity with me. And so Esther begins to contemplate what she will say to the king when she walks in there uninvited. So the first day goes by. You can imagine she's thinking about every scenario. The second day goes by. She's trying to imagine how she'll respond. The third day goes by. She may be thinking about, this may be the last sunset I see. And then on the end of the third day, she goes up in the palace toward the top, toward the king's court, the royal throne room, and enters with her heart racing. This may be her last moment alive. And suddenly the king looks up. He's probably surprised to see her, but then a smile goes across his face, and he welcomes Esther into the court. And I can imagine that Esther at that point felt a great deal of relief. This dramatic moment is captured in a mosaic by Lillian Broca, and I love the way it captures kind of the relief on her face that she must have felt when she realizes, oh, I'm not going to die. This is great. So upon her approaching the throne, the king says to her, what is your desire, Queen Esther? What do you request of me? Whatever it is, I will give it to you, up to half of my empire, which sounds like a pretty good deal. But Esther has another agenda, doesn't she? And we assume that the next line will be, my people are in danger. But she doesn't say that because her cultural identity is still hidden at this point. So she can't say my people because her king doesn't know what her Jewish heritage is. And so she responds by saying to the king, well, this is a special day for me. If it pleases my sovereign, I would like you and Haman to be the guests of honor at a banquet I will prepare today. You can imagine the king thinks to himself, you could have asked for anything you wanted and you just want me to come to dinner? You so romantic girl. And so the king says, summon Haman right now so that we may go and do what Esther desires. And so they go to the place where Esther has prepared a banquet for 3 of them, and there is copious amounts of wine according to the writing in the Bible. And after they have been drinking for a while, the king says, seriously, Esther, what do you desire? Anything you say will be given to you. And it's here that we assume that Esther will tell him about Haman, but she doesn't. Instead, she says, this is my request. If I have found favor in the sight of my sovereign, let my sovereign and Haman return again to a second banquet that I will prepare for them tomorrow night. Now, it's here that Haman, who has been drinking, may I remind you, feels pretty good about himself. He's being invited to a very exclusive party. Just the king, the queen, and Haman. And so Haman hears that he's getting invited back, and he thinks to himself, I must have made a pretty good impression on the queen. And so the Bible tells us in the book of Esther that Haman was filled with joy upon leaving this party, until he saw the sight of Mordecai in the courtyard. And upon just seeing Mordecai, he was filled with rage. He hated Mordecai, and it ruined his entire day. This is like a commentary on social media, is it not? I don't know about you, but I've been having a great day, and then all of a sudden, I open social media at the wrong time, and I see someone else having a little more fun than me, and I'm like, my day's terrible. Anyone else feel that? Just me, okay. I saw one hand up over here, so I'm not alone. That's great. So Haman, his day's ruined. He goes home to his wife, Zeresh. Let me hear you say Zeresh this morning. He says, Zeresh, I was doing great. I got invited to the king and queen's exclusive banquet. And then I saw Mordecai and just, he ruined my day. Zeresh says, why don't you build a gallows and hang him on it tomorrow? But not just any gallows. Why don't you build it to be 75 feet high? And Haman says, that is a great idea. I will build a 75-foot tall gallows tomorrow. Now, I don't know about you, but you can just hear that number and say, okay, 75 feet, that sounds tall. 75 feet is ridiculously tall. To put that in perspective, we have a ridiculous building in the city of Redlands that just stands out above everything else. It's the Citibank building downtown, right? It's like the skyscraper among no skyscrapers, right? This building here is 85 feet tall, okay? You cannot go anywhere in Redlands without seeing this thing, right? And so just 10 feet shorter, Zeresh is like, yeah, what are you doing tomorrow morning? Why don't you build a 75-foot tall hanging platform and hang your sworn enemy on it? He's like, that'll be great. I'll wake up early and get it done. Such a weird conversation. Anyways, he wakes up and gets it done in the morning, apparently. And then he prepares himself for this banquet, and he goes to the banquet with Esther and the king. And once again, the Bible tells us in this book that there is copious amounts of wine being drunk by the king, Haman, and the queen. And after drinking for some time, the king turns to Esther and says to her, "What do you desire, Esther? Please tell me. Anything you say will be given to you." And it's here on the third time that Esther's tone switches. She stands up from the table, and she says to the king this, "My sovereign, if I have found favor in your eyes, and if it be your wish, I ask you to spare my life and the lives of my people. That is what I desire most. For we, my people and I, have been condemned to be destroyed, slain, and turned into chattel, ourselves and our children. Had you merely intended to make us slaves, I would have said nothing. All this has been told to me by a reliable source. Our enemy brings shame upon the imperial court." Now you can imagine the king's probably scratching his head because he has no idea at this point that Esther is Jewish. And Haman is probably there just all of a sudden being like, oh no, is she Jewish? And you can imagine and feel the tension around this table that just a few seconds ago was a jovial drinking party, right? And so the king says to his queen, who would do such a thing? And Esther points across the table and says, our enemy is this scoundrel Haman. Now, according to the Bible, the king gets so upset because this is his second in command threatening to kill his wife, and he feels like he's been tricked. So he leaves the room, leaving Esther with this person who has threatened to kill her, which is probably not the best move in hindsight there, king. Haman begins begging for his life. He says, Esther, show me mercy. Please show me mercy. The king comes back in, and he sees Haman close to his wife, and he assumes that he is assaulting her. And so the king says to her, do you dare to attack my wife in our own house? And it's here that all of a sudden, we didn't know this person was there just a few moments ago, a eunuch from the corner speaks up and says, his name is Harbona, and Harbona stands up and he says, hey, everything that Esther said was true. I walked by Haman's house this morning, and there was a 75-foot gallows in the front yard. So I've seen it for myself. And the king's like, what? And that's the proof. This giant gallows is there. And the king says, that's enough. It's time instead for us to hang Mordecai from this gallows. We're going to instead hang Haman. And the chapter ends violently with Haman's death and his body being hung from this 75-foot gallows. The next chapter then begins with the king turning to Mordecai, who is revealed to be Esther's adopted father, and their heritage is fully revealed, that the king wants to make amends for threatening to kill all the Jewish people. And so we read that Ahasuerus had taken the signet ring from Haman and now gave it to Mordecai, and Esther placed Mordecai in charge of Haman's house. So Mordecai then gets Haman's riches, his wealth, and all that Haman oversaw. We then go on to read that Esther spoke to the ruler again. Showing him honor, she asked him to stop all of the violence that Haman had planned against the Jewish people. And the king said to Esther, take my ring, and whatever you decide, everyone in Persia will follow. And so Esther sends out an edict from the royal halls saying that Jewish people should be free to be who they are, and you cannot just kill one because you want to kill one. In fact, the Bible tells it this way, which is in the letter that Ahasuerus ordered, which was written by Esther, that the Jewish community in each city be allowed to observe their own laws, defend themselves, and act as they wished against their enemies. Shortly after that, Esther declares that there will be a feast practiced by Jewish folks that will go on for generations and generations. That feast is Purim, and it is practiced to this day, and it will be practiced once again and observed by Jewish communities around the world in just 2 weeks' time. So this is the story of Queen Esther, the woman who started as a sex slave, somehow won a terrible, oppressive, patriarchal contest, and became a queen who walked into a hall uninvited, risked her life, and became self-assured in who she was, that she then later on began writing royal rules and edicts, and the king trusted her as one of his closest advisors. I point all of this out because what we need to acknowledge as a religious community that holds the Bible as an inspired book is we need to acknowledge that Esther is an inspirational biblical hero. To rise from nothing to become something is always an inspirational story, and that is Esther's story. But I want to pause here for a second and consider an alternative telling of this story. How would this story change? How would Esther's story change if it occurred not in Susa 2,500 years ago, but occurred in a utopian society, a perfect society, where genders, all genders, were considered to be equal? How would this story change if Esther was a co-equal ruler with the king? And all of a sudden, in that story, Mordecai hears about this law that needs to be changed. He goes to Esther, and Esther says, well, I'll change that right away. And the story's over, right? It's not really an inspirational tale, is it? It's not really exciting. It's not dramatic. And when we talk about the Bible being an inspired work, this is a story that if Esther had an oversight and accidentally allowed a genocide to occur under her watch, that's not an inspiring person. And if she could just, like that, change the laws, there's not a whole lot of inspiration behind that story. I point this out because what we need to acknowledge as we read this story is that without risk, the threat of her dying entering that court, there cannot be any inspiration. And are these rules oppressive and backwards and sexist and chauvinist? Yes, of course. But the inspirational nature of this story derives from the evil of this story, right? The reason we call this an inspiring person is because she risked her life to speak up for what was right, rather than just stay comfy in the royal palace. And when I think about Esther's story and her trajectory and her agency, and as she grew more and more empowered in her voice, it reminds me of another story that took place much more recently than 2,500 years ago. To tell you this story, I want to take you to a place called Delta in the state of Louisiana, where in 1867, a woman named Sarah Breedlove was born. Now, she was born to parents who were sharecroppers on cotton fields, and her parents had actually even been enslaved in their lifetime and experienced freedom toward the end of their life. Now, before Sarah Breedlove was an adult, her parents both passed away. And she became an orphan at a very young age, and she was able to find her way up to Vicksburg. And it was here that she married a man named Roger McWilliams, and she gave birth to her one and only child, Lelia McWilliams. And Lelia and her were trying their best to find a life for, African-American folks. They had Roger McWilliams, but Roger McWilliams suddenly died, and it was just Sarah and Lelia who were trying to make their way through the American way of life in the mid-19th century. Well, eventually, Sarah Breedlove heard that she could, as a washwoman, make a much better living if she moved from Vicksburg, Mississippi, all the way up to St. Louis, Missouri, because they paid much better up there. So she brought her daughter with her. She moved to St. Louis, and she became a washwoman for a wealthy businessman in town. Excuse me, I said the wrong thing. Wealthy businesswoman in town, whose name was Annie Turnbow. And Annie Turnbow was a woman who had made a business by selling cosmetic supplies to African-American women in the late 19th century. And Sarah Breedlove was inspired by her. She was making a better living as a washwoman, but it wasn't much that she was living on. And as Sarah was growing, her stress was increasing, and her hair started falling out in her late 30s. And this is a picture of Sarah Breedlove in her late 30s. She had lost a lot of her hair, and she loved her hair. So as she tells the story, she prayed to God and said, God, can you please help my hair to grow back because I love my hair and I don't love the way I look without it. And the way she tells the story is that God answered her prayer, and God answered her prayer in a bit of an unconventional manner. She said, for one night, I had a dream, and in this dream, there was a big black man who appeared to me and told me what to mix up for my hair. So this man gave her all of these ingredients. She remembered them from her dream, woke up, wrote them down, mixed them together, and she went from looking like this to looking like this. Her hair grew back. And after experiencing all of this firsthand, according to Sarah Breedlove, she says, at that moment, I knew I was going to sell this mix and start a business. Now, she looked around at the lay of the land at St. Louis, and she said, oh, there's too many businesses here to compete with. I want to go somewhere where I don't have to compete with other manufacturers who are selling beauty products to African-American women. So she moved to Denver, Colorado, of all places, and in 1905, she started her business. Now, it's important to know a few things about her moving here in 1905. She moved to Denver in 1905, hoping to start a business with a grand total of $1.50 in savings. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm sure there's been some inflation since 1905, you're absolutely right. There is an equivalent to that in today's economy, and the equivalent is $53.80. Not a whole lot of money to start a business, right? But she started working as a chef in Denver, and then she would make these hair products at night, and then she'd go on the weekend, she'd go door to door and sell these products to African-American women, saying, I can help regrow your hair, or she would help give them a manicure. She would do other things for them, and her business started to get some traction in 1906. A year later, she started to see some results, some profits. Eventually, she met a man named C.J. Walker, who she married, and she wanted to compete with the French beauty project, so she decided to change her name to the way the French people do it. So she changed her name to Madam C.J. Walker. And her main product was this right here, her wonderful hair grower. It's called Madam C.J. Walker's Wonderful Hair Grower. And she would sell it door to door. And once she started getting a lot of orders, she realized she needed other people to help her. So she started hiring people to go door to door to sell this as well. She called them Walker agents. And these Walker agents, not only could they sell hair products, they could give manicures, they could give massages, they could do haircuts. She would train them to be this full service experience that would go door to door, and then she would earn money as well as these Walker agents. Not only that, but her husband, C.J. Walker, really helped her figure out the mailing part of mail order for this wonderful hair grower, and she was able to mail this hair product out to all corners of the country because of the help of C.J. Walker. And as the business grew, she realized that there was much more opportunities beyond the city of Denver. So she moved with her husband to Pittsburgh, and there she founded the Lelia College. She named it after her daughter, the Lelia College for Beauty. And they had graduations, and they taught women how to not only create beauty products, but also to take care of people with all of those different things. And several of those graduates became Walker agents. And while she was in Pittsburgh, she realized there's an even better opportunity beyond Pittsburgh in the city of Indianapolis because it was a manufacturing city. So she felt like she could upscale her production and potentially make more money. So she moved to Indianapolis in 1910. This is her in front of her place in 1911. And then they also built a factory that same year where they were making her hair product in the year 1911. At this point, she was making so much money that when the Black YMCA said, we need $1,000, as much as that is, to finish our building here in Indianapolis, she was able to write them a check for that amount in full and gave them $1,000 in 1911. And they said, who are you? What? And she became a philanthropist from that moment forward. However, she and her husband didn't get along from that moment forward either. And so she divorced C.J. Walker, and she turned to her daughter, Lelia, and she said, would you like to be second in charge in my company? And Lelia, of course, said yes. She changed her name to Lelia Walker, And after getting promoted by her mom, she said, why don't we go to Harlem? Because there's lots of product that we could sell there. There's a thriving African American community there. We could sell our product there and increase our profits even further. So Madam C.J. Walker and Lelia moved to New York City, and they began selling their product in Harlem, as well as establishing a beauty school and employing Walker agents to sell their product for them. Now, at this point, she's doing so well in business that she decides that Madam C.J. Walker, is going to build her own dream house. And she's building it just outside of New York City, and it's actually preserved, and you can go there to this day. She was able to build it within 3 years, and this is what her home looked like in 1916, and the backyard is rather stunning, in my opinion. She was able to build this in 1916. And what's crazy is, not many people know this, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Madam C.J. Walker, who passed away 3 years after this house was completed in 1919, the Guinness Book of World Records has it in their records that the first woman to earn a personal fortune of more than $1 million is Madam C.J. Walker, whose net worth was estimated to have exceeded $1 million at the time of her death in 1919. So she is the first female self-made millionaire in American history, regardless of race. And when you consider that this was 1919 that she passed away, you just have to go back 13 years earlier and realize she was able to do this in 13 years. Not only that, but she started when she was 39. I'm 41. The thought of starting Paradox anew now is exhausting. And yet she started it when she was 39, and all of a sudden she became a millionaire, and she only had $1.50 in savings just 13 years before. And when you consider Madam C.J. Walker's story, you realize she was much more than just a businesswoman. She was also a philanthropist and activist. In 1917, she actually went to the White House and talked with President Woodrow Wilson, begging him to make lynching a federal crime that could be prosecuted at the federal level. She also gave $5,000 to the NAACP later in her life. It was the largest single donation they'd ever received up at that point in history. She gave that money saying, I want you guys to prosecute people who lynch African Americans. This is awful and it needs to stop. She also organized a protest in New York City with the race riots that were horrible in 1917 in St. Louis, Missouri. So she also sought activism as well as philanthropy. And when she died, she wanted to give back to the city that gave her the most, which was the city of Indianapolis. And within 5 years, her daughter oversaw the construction of the Walker Theater, which still stands to this day in Indianapolis. And it's a rather stunning building that is there to provide Indianapolis with the arts and an experience that Indianapolis really enjoys on a regular basis. So when I think of the story of Madam C.J. Walker, this is a story of a successful businesswoman who started from nothing. And when her hair started falling out, all of a sudden there was this opportunity. And while she will credit her faith, it is remarkable that she went from this to all of a sudden having hair again and finding a way to market it and sell it. And when you consider this woman's story, I think that we can all agree that Madam C.J. Walker is an inspirational American hero, right? But let's imagine her story if we change it to a utopian society. One where there's no racism, one where there's no sexism, one where there's nothing that would suggest that this would be hard for her to do, one where she's just given money to start a business, one where she inherits all of that money. Well, is it inspiring if somebody becomes a millionaire if they're given $800,000 to start? Not so much, right? But when you consider this moment in 1905 when she says, I decided I was going to sell this hair product, and all the risk that was there, all the fear that might have been there, all the uncertainty, she decided to step forward and became one of the most successful businesswomen in American history. This is a risky, frightening moment for her. And what her story teaches us is that without risk, there cannot be inspiration. You need that risk. You need those obstacles in order for your story to become inspiring. And when you consider Madam C.J. Walker and Queen Esther and their stories, which I find to be incredibly similar, the thing that really stands out for me in this story is that there is this book that is Esther. It is the only book in the entire Bible that doesn't mention God. Well, Song of Solomon does too, but mentions it in passing. Esther, though, is the only one that doesn't mention God actively. And so when you consider that this book is in the Bible, and what it tells us about the life of Esther is it tells us something rather remarkable. Rather than the inspiration of God being found in expected places, the inspiration of God is not found in the mention of God's name. Instead, the inspiration of God is found in bringing light to the darkness. It is found in the movement of finding your own voice and standing up for what is right, not just saying, well, God was there, or I give God all the credit, or I'm religious, so I did the right thing. And while I look at Madam C.J. Walker's story, and I think about her fortune that she amassed, I will tell you that I get emotional when I look at pictures at this place just about a century before, when she brought all of her employees to her mansion, and she had a convention there for her company, and you look and you realize just how many people she employed, and how these are all people who have a hard time getting jobs at other places. And she would take pictures with them in the back and then also in the front. And these were all employees. They were Walker agents. They were people who oversaw the corporation. And she desperately wanted to give them an opportunity to live beyond the lowest level of poverty. One of her former employees said this about her. They said, Madam C.J. Walker opened up a trade for hundreds of colored women to make an honest and profitable living where they make as much in 1 week as a month's salary would bring from any other position that a colored woman can secure. Not only that, but Britannica says that by 1919, she had claimed 25,000 active Walker sales agents. She was employing 25,000 people. And in 1914, she had the opportunity to speak at the NNBL, a business association for African Americans. And she said these words in her speech to the NNBL. She said, I am not merely satisfied in making money for myself, for I am endeavoring to provide employment for hundreds of the women of my race. And that number would later become thousands. I point this out because when I think of all that Madam C.J. Walker did, I am most impressed by her ability to employ so many people that society would give a hard time to employing. And when I think about our story today, in the year 2025, and all the things we face, I think that we so often wish for things that don't exist. I think we wish for things to be free of suffering. I think we wish for things to be more equal. I think we wish for things to be better. Well, we're here, whether we like it or not. We're here in this place, in this year, and in this time. And when I think about all that we have to face today in 2025, and all the different things that other people have to face with their own stories, it can be daunting, right? It can be infuriating, in fact. But at the same time, we are called to live here and now with the evils that currently exist, the evils of sexism and homophobia and racism and more. This is where we are called to be. And when we look at who is being elevated in our society right now, there is this proverbial question that all of us are asking, because we are asking ourselves, what's the point of even trying to be good? Because it doesn't seem like people who are good get ahead. It seems like people who are the most outlandish, outrageous, the most bombastic, end up advancing their career much further than people who are trying to be good. And when we ask this important question of what's the point of trying to be good, it's a question that is worth asking in 2025. And for me, when I look at the story of Esther and the story of Madam C.J. Walker, I pause and I say to myself, isn't the point that the inspiration is found in the way that we live here and now? and in trying to move forward and do the right thing. What's the point of trying to be good? It's we try to be good because that's where we believe God is found. When we do our best to do what we can to control all that is against us and make it better for other people, we are living in the presence of God, even if God is hard to see. And so I hope that as you go through this next week and this next month and these next years, that you will pause and say to yourself, why am I trying to be good? And you may realize that the whole story of our tradition as Christians is that we believe that that is where the inspiration is found. We believe that that's where the work of God is. Not in making more money for ourselves, but for trying our best to be who God created us to be and giving a good life to ourselves, but more importantly to others. My friends, may you love the story of Esther and the story of Madam C.J. Walker, and may you find the inspiration of God in every risk you take. Amen.